Three armed criminals. One elderly security guard. A bank full of innocent people. When professional thieves with military-grade planning entered First National Bank that Monday morning, they expected an easy score. What they got instead was a 67-year-old man who had been waiting his entire career for exactly this moment. In the next 30 minutes, you'll witness how Joseph Williams, dismissed by everyone as just the old guard, single-handedly dismantled what law enforcement later called the most sophisticated bank robbery attempt in Chicago's history. This isn't just a story about stopping a crime. This is a masterclass in how real security isn't about cameras or alarms. It's about having the right person in the right place at the right time. Welcome to Real Security Stories, where we uncover the extraordinary people hiding behind ordinary jobs. Before we dive into this incredible tale of experience versus technology, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Trust me, you'll want to stay for every minute of this one. Meet Joseph Joe Williams, 67 years old, and for the past 3 years the day shift security guard at First National Bank on West Monroe Street in downtown Chicago. Every morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., Joe would park his aging Honda Civic in the employee lot, walk slowly to the staff entrance, and begin what everyone assumed was the easiest job in the building. To the bank employees, Joe was exactly what central casting would order for a grandfather figure. Gray hair neatly combed, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck, uniform always pressed but hanging loose on his slight frame. He moved deliberately, spoke softly, and had the kind of gentle smile that made customers feel welcome and employees feel safe. "Morning, Grandpa Joe," the tellers would call out as they hurried past his desk near the front entrance. Joe would look up from his newspaper, wave with genuine warmth, and go back to what appeared to be a very leisurely workday. He checked employee badges, monitored the front door, and occasionally walked the bank floor with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Sarah Martinez, head teller, had worked at the bank for 8 years and considered Joe part of the furniture. He was like everyone's grandfather, she would later tell investigators. Sweet, harmless, and honestly, we all wondered what he actually did all day. He read the sports section, did crossword puzzles, and waved at customers. It was hard to imagine him stopping a bicycle thief, let alone professional bank robbers. Bank manager David Chen inherited Joe when he transferred to the branch 2 years earlier. During their annual performance reviews, Chen would gently probe about Joe's long-term plans, hoping the older man would consider retirement. The bank's corporate office had been pushing for younger, more physically capable security personnel, preferably with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Joe was a nice man, don't get me wrong, Chen would explain to the Chicago Tribune months later. But when you think about bank security, you want someone who looks like they could handle trouble. Joe looked like someone who needed help opening pickle jars. What none of them knew was that Joseph Williams had indeed come from a law enforcement background. 30 years of it, to be exact. From 1975 to 2005, Detective Joseph Williams had worked for the Chicago Police Department, not in traffic violations or community relations, but in the robbery division, specializing in financial crimes, bank heists, armored car theft, credit union robberies. If someone tried to steal money from a financial institution in Chicago, Joe Williams was likely to be the detective assigned to catch them. During his 3 decades on the force, Joe had investigated over 200 bank robberies. He had seen every method, every trick, every technique that criminals use to separate banks from their money. He had crawled through air conditioning ducts following escape routes, studied surveillance footage frame by frame, and interviewed hundreds of bank employees to understand how robberies succeeded or failed. Joe had arrested everyone from desperate amateurs who passed notes to tellers, to sophisticated crews who used inside information and military-style precision. He had testified in federal court, worked with the FBI on multi-state cases, and earned commendations for solving cases that other detectives couldn't crack. But in 2005, at age 60, Joe decided it was time for a quieter life. His wife Margaret had been asking him to retire for years, worried about the dangers of police work. Their children were grown, the pension was adequate, and Joe was tired of spending his days thinking about the worst things people could do to each other. For 3 years Joe enjoyed retirement. He read books, worked in his garden, and took long walks with Margaret through the neighborhoods he had once patrolled. But in 2008, Margaret passed away from cancer, and Joe found himself alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. The job at First National Bank wasn't about the money. Joe's police pension was sufficient. It was about having somewhere to go, something to do, and people to interact with. He never mentioned his police background during the interview, simply saying he was a retiree looking for part-time work. The bank manager at the time saw a responsible older gentleman who would provide a reassuring presence for customers and staff. Joe was content to let everyone think he was just a grandfather figure earning extra spending money. After 30 years of dealing with criminals, victims, and crime scenes, he enjoyed the peaceful routine of checking badges and greeting customers. But old habits die hard. Even in retirement, Joe's detective instincts remained sharp. He noticed things, which customers seemed nervous, which employees broke routine, which visitors asked unusual questions. He memorized faces, observed patterns, and filed away details that might someday prove important. Joe never expected those instincts to matter again. He was wrong. The crew that would eventually face Joe Williams had been planning the First National Bank job for 6 months. They weren't desperate amateurs or opportunistic criminals. They were professionals who approached bank robbery like a complex business operation, complete with research, planning, and risk assessment. The leader was Mark Thompson, 42, a former Army sergeant who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a dishonorable discharge for theft ended his military career. Thompson had discovered that his skills in reconnaissance, logistics, and small unit tactics translated surprisingly well to civilian crime. Over the past 5 years, he had successfully orchestrated robberies of 4 banks and 2 credit unions across 3 states, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Thompson's approach was methodical. He never targeted banks randomly, instead spending months studying potential locations, identifying weaknesses, and assembling the right team for each specific job. He recruited specialists, people with particular skills who could contribute to the operation's success. For the Chicago job, Thompson had recruited 2 key partners. The first was Linda Lynn Foster, 38, who had worked as a compliance officer for various financial institutions before a gambling addiction led to embezzlement charges and prison time. Foster's insider knowledge of banking procedures, security protocols, and regulatory requirements made her invaluable for reconnaissance. She could walk into any bank, ask detailed questions about procedures, and sound completely legitimate because she understood the industry from the inside. The second partner was Kevin Key Ramirez, 29, a former electronics technician who had developed impressive skills in surveillance technology and security system manipulation. Ramirez could plant listening devices, hack basic computer systems, and disable standard alarm equipment. His technical expertise complemented Thompson's tactical planning and Foster's institutional knowledge. Together, they had successfully robbed banks in Indianapolis, Milwaukee, and Des Moines, always using the same basic approach: extensive surveillance, inside information gathering, and precise execution during optimal timing window. They never took unnecessary risks, never used excessive force, and always had multiple escape routes planned. The Chicago job began in October 2010, when Thompson drove through downtown during lunch hour, evaluating potential targets. First National Bank caught his attention for several reasons. It was located on a busy street with multiple escape routes, had a relatively small customer area that could be controlled easily, and appeared to process significant daily cash volumes based on the steady stream of business customers. More importantly, the bank's security appeared standard and predictable. Thompson observed the building for 3 days, noting camera positions, guard routines, and traffic patterns. What he saw was a typical mid-size urban bank with typical mid-size urban security measures. Phase 1 of the operation was reconnaissance, which began in November. Foster visited the bank twice, once to open a small business checking account and once to inquire about commercial lending services. During these visits, she engaged employees in conversations about procedures, schedules, and security measures. Banking professionals love to talk about their expertise, and Foster knew exactly which questions to ask. "The security seems very thorough," Foster mentioned to Sarah Martinez during her account opening. "Do you have regular protocols for cash deliveries and vault access?" Sarah, proud of the bank's professional operations, explained that cash deliveries occurred twice weekly on a fixed schedule, that vault access was controlled by time locks and dual authorization, and that all transactions over certain amounts triggered specific verification procedures. Foster also learned about employee schedules, break rotations, and which staff members had been with the bank longest. She discovered that the bank opened at 9 a.m. with a 2-hour preparation period, that Mondays were typically slower than other weekdays, and that the elderly security guard was considered more of a customer service representative than actual security. "Joe's sweet," Sarah had mentioned casually. "But honestly, I'm not sure what he'd do if we actually had trouble. He's more like a grandfather than a guard." Phase 2 was technical surveillance, handled by Ramirez during December and January. He visited the bank multiple times, sometimes as a customer conducting small transactions, sometimes as a delivery person or maintenance worker. Each visit allowed him to study the electronic systems, camera coverage, and potential vulnerabilities. Ramirez identified several key weaknesses. The alarm system was a standard commercial model that he had encountered before. The cameras covered most of the customer area but had blind spots near the employee workstations. Most importantly, the bank's computer network used outdated security protocols that would allow him to disable certain systems remotely. During one visit, posing as a technician updating the building's internet service, Ramirez managed to plant a small listening device in the employee break room. For 3 weeks, this device recorded conversations about daily routines, security procedures, and employee concerns. The recordings revealed that several staff members had expressed doubts about Joe's effectiveness as security, that cash delivery schedules were widely known among employees, and that certain vault procedures were discussed openly. Phase 3 was detailed planning, which Thompson conducted throughout February and March. Using Foster's inside information and Ramirez's technical intelligence, Thompson developed what he considered a foolproof approach. The plan called for a Monday morning entry at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the bank opened to customers. Thompson, Foster, and Ramirez would approach the employee entrance posing as federal bank examiners conducting a surprise compliance inspection. Foster's banking background would make their credentials credible, and the early timing would catch staff members off guard and unprepared to verify their identities. Once inside, they would quickly secure the small staff present during the preparation period, disable the alarm systems using Ramirez's technical skills, and access the vault using information Foster had gathered about procedures and timing. The entire operation would take less than 20 minutes, and they would be gone before the bank was scheduled to open for business. Thompson had planned escape routes through the downtown business district, using the morning rush hour traffic as cover. Safe houses were prepared in 3 different directions from the bank. Vehicle changes were arranged at 2 different locations. Even if law enforcement responded immediately, the crew would have multiple options for disappearing into the urban landscape. The plan accounted for every variable Thompson could imagine: police response times, employee resistance, technical failures, and traffic condition. It was, by any objective measure, a sophisticated and well-researched criminal operation. There was just one variable Thompson hadn't considered: the possibility that the harmless elderly security guard might not be as harmless as he appeared. While Thompson's crew was conducting their surveillance, Joe Williams was conducting surveillance of his own. Not deliberately, and not because he suspected a robbery was being planned, but because 30 years of police work had trained him to notice patterns that most people missed. The first anomaly Joe noticed was in late November, during Foster's second visit to the bank. Foster had done everything right. She dressed professionally, asked appropriate questions, and behaved exactly like a legitimate business customer. But Joe noticed something in her body language that bothered him. Foster's eyes moved too much. She was cataloging details, camera positions, employee workstations, sight lines from the entrance to the vault area. Normal customers focused on the person helping them or on their own paperwork. Foster was conducting a visual inventory of the entire bank, and she was doing it systematically, like someone with training. Joe didn't immediately suspect criminal intent. Foster might have been a security consultant, an insurance investigator, or simply someone with professional interest in banking operations. But Joe made a mental note: unusual visitor conducting detailed observation. The second sign came in December, when Ramirez made his first technical surveillance visit. Ramirez had prepared a cover story about updating networking equipment, complete with official-looking identification and authentic-seeming work orders. He convinced the bank staff to allow him access to areas where customers weren't normally permitted. But Joe noticed that Ramirez spent more time looking at the alarm control panel than at the computer equipment he was supposedly servicing. When Ramirez thought no one was watching, he took photographs of the security system's control interface with a small camera concealed in his toolkit. Joe also noticed that Ramirez asked questions about the building's layout that seemed unrelated to networking infrastructure. How many employees worked each shift? Whether anyone stayed in the building overnight? Which entrances were used by staff versus customers? Again, Joe didn't jump to criminal conclusions. Building service technicians often needed broad information about a facility's operations. But combined with Foster's earlier visit, Joe began to feel the familiar tingling of police instincts that had been dormant for 5 years. The third sign was the most obvious, at least to someone with Joe's background. In January, Joe noticed a dark blue sedan parked across from the bank on 3 different occasions. The car was occupied each time, always with someone sitting in the driver's seat, apparently waiting. Normal people wait in their cars for many legitimate reasons: picking up passengers, making phone calls, eating lunch. But this car's occupant was watching the bank, and he was watching with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence. Joe observed the watcher for 20 minutes during one incident. The man never looked at his phone, never ate anything, never appeared to be waiting for someone. He was simply watching the bank's entrance, noting who came and went, timing the flow of employees and customers. When Joe walked outside to get a closer look, the car immediately drove away. Professional surveillance teams are trained to abort observation if they suspect they've been noticed. Amateur surveillance might continue despite detection. This was professional. By February, Joe was certain that First National Bank was being systematically studied by people with criminal intent. He had 3 choices: report his suspicions to bank management, contact Chicago PD directly, or wait and watch. Joe chose to wait and watch, for several reasons. First, he had no concrete evidence of criminal activity. Visiting a bank, asking questions, and sitting in a parked car weren't crime. Bank manager David Chen already considered Joe an elderly employee whose best days were behind him. Reporting vague suspicions about suspicious behavior would only confirm Chen's belief that Joe was paranoid or confused. Second, Joe's police experience told him that surveillance usually preceded action by only a few weeks. If criminals were planning to rob the bank, they would move soon. Premature law enforcement intervention might simply cause them to abandon this target and select another bank, another set of victims. Third, and most importantly, Joe realized he was in a unique position. The criminals conducting surveillance had dismissed him as irrelevant, just as his bank colleagues did. They might be planning for security cameras, alarm systems, and police response times, but they weren't planning for a retired detective who knew exactly what to look for. Joe began his own counter-surveillance operation. He varied his daily routine, positioning himself in different locations around the bank to observe who was watching the building. He started arriving early and leaving late, expanding his window of observation. He began keeping detailed notes about suspicious visitors, unusual incidents, and patterns that didn't feel right. Joe also started thinking like a criminal. If he were planning to rob First National Bank, how would he do it? What were the building's vulnerabilities? What were the optimal timing windows? Which approaches would minimize risk and maximize success? This wasn't an academic exercise. Joe had spent 3 decades studying how bank robberies succeeded and failed. He understood the psychology of criminal planning, the logistics of escape routes, and the tactical considerations that professional crews evaluated. If criminals were planning to rob his bank, Joe wanted to understand their plan better than they did. The breakthrough came in March, when Joe discovered the listening device. Joe had been conducting informal security sweeps of the bank, looking for anything unusual or out of place. It was a habit from his police days. when checking for surveillance equipment was standard procedure in sensitive investigation. Most bank employees wouldn't think to look for listening devices, but most bank employees hadn't spent 30 years investigating crimes where intelligence gathering was crucial. Joe found the device in the employee break room, attached to the underside of a table where staff members often discussed work-related matters during lunch. The device was small, professionally manufactured, and designed for long-term covert recording. This wasn't spy store equipment purchased by amateurs. This was serious surveillance technology. The device confirmed Joe's suspicions and escalated the threat levels significantly. Professional criminals using professional equipment meant this wasn't a crime of opportunity or a desperate amateur operation. Someone was investing serious time, money, and expertise into gathering intelligence about First National Bank. Joe now faced a more urgent decision. He could remove the device and report it immediately, but that would alert the criminals that their surveillance had been detected. They might abort the operation, but they might also accelerate their timeline or switch to more aggressive method. Alternatively, Joe could leave the device in place and begin preparing for whatever the criminals were planning. This was more dangerous, but it offered the possibility of catching the entire crew in the act, rather than simply disrupting their surveillance. Joe chose the second option, but he didn't choose it blindly. He began preparing himself in the bank for what he now believed was an inevitable robbery attempt. Joe started carrying his off-duty weapon again, properly licensed and concealed. He hadn't carried a gun since retiring from the police force, but the listening device convinced him that this situation might require more than observation and reporting. Joe also began studying the bank's actual security measures with the critical eye of someone who understood how criminals would try to defeat them. The alarm system was standard but had several vulnerabilities. The cameras provided good coverage but had blind spots. The vault security was adequate for normal operations, but might not withstand a determined professional assault. Most importantly, Joe began developing contingency plans for different robbery scenarios. If criminals entered during business hours, how would he protect customers and employees? If they entered during preparation time, how would he maintain communication with law enforcement? If they disabled standard security measures, what backup options were available? Joe's police training had taught him that the best way to stop a crime was to be more prepared than the criminals committing it. Professional bank robbers invested weeks or months in planning. Joe would invest the same level of preparation in stopping them. The final piece of intelligence came in late March, when Joe observed the surveillance team conducting what appeared to be a final reconnaissance mission. All three members visited the bank within a 2-day period, each conducting specific tasks that suggested they were finalizing operational details. Foster returned to ask questions about recent changes in banking procedures, particularly anything related to cash delivery schedules or security updates. Ramirez appeared again, this time claiming to test communication equipment, but actually verifying that his previous technical surveillance was still providing useful information. Thompson himself made his first direct appearance, posing as a businessman inquiring about commercial accounts while actually studying sightlines, timing, and staff behavior. Joe recognized the pattern: final intelligence gathering before operational execution. In his experience, criminals who conducted this type of detailed surveillance usually moved within 1 to 2 weeks after completing their reconnaissance. Joe was ready for them. Monday, April 12, 2011, began like any other day at First National Bank, with one crucial difference. Joe Williams arrived at 6:30 a.m. instead of his usual 6:45. He wanted extra time to prepare for what his instincts told him was going to be an extraordinary day. Joe's first task was to conduct a complete security assessment of the building. He checked every entrance, verified that all alarm systems were functioning properly, and confirmed that surveillance cameras were recording correctly. He also tested the silent alarm system, ensuring that it would immediately notify Chicago PD and the bank's security company in case of emergency. Next, Joe reviewed the day's staffing schedule. Monday mornings typically operated with a skeleton crew during the 2-hour preparation period before customer service began at 9 a.m. Today's schedule showed 6 employees: bank manager David Chen, head teller Sarah Martinez, 2 additional tellers, a loan officer, and Joe himself. Joe made a decision that probably saved lives. He convinced Chen to send one of the junior tellers home early. "David," Joe said, approaching the manager's office at 7:30 a.m., Jessica looks like she's coming down with something. Might be better if she goes home before she spreads it to the rest of the staff. Chen barely looked up from his paperwork. Fine, Joe. Thanks for letting me know. Jessica Harrison, 23, had indeed been sniffling all morning. But Joe's real motivation was reducing the number of potential victims if his suspicions proved correct. Professional criminals preferred small groups of employees because they were easier to control and less likely to resist. By 8:00 a.m., the bank had its normal pre-opening complement of 5 employees. Joe positioned himself at his usual station near the front entrance, but with several modifications to his routine. Instead of sitting behind his small desk reading the newspaper, Joe remained standing, giving him better mobility and sightlines throughout the bank. Instead of focusing on his crossword puzzle, Joe kept his attention on the street outside, watching for vehicles or individuals that didn't belong in the morning business district pattern. Most importantly, Joe discreetly tested his communication equipment. His radio was functioning properly and connected to both bank security and Chicago PD emergency frequencies. His cell phone was charged and programmed with direct numbers for robbery division detectives he had worked with during his police career. At 8:15 a.m., Joe noticed unusual traffic patterns outside the bank. Normally, Monday morning foot traffic consisted of office workers heading to nearby buildings, delivery trucks making scheduled stops, and early customers walking toward businesses that opened at 8 a.m. But Joe observed 3 individuals who didn't fit these patterns. A woman in a business suit was walking slowly past the bank, appearing to check her phone while actually observing the employee entrance. A man in casual clothes was sitting on a bench across the street, reading a newspaper but glancing frequently at the bank building. A second man was standing near a parked van, supposedly making a phone call but positioned to watch both the front and side entrances. These 3 individuals were conducting final surveillance, positioning themselves to observe the bank's morning routine and confirm that conditions matched their expectations. Joe recognized the behavior because he had conducted similar surveillance during undercover police operations. At 8:30 a.m., the woman approached the bank's front entrance and knocked on the glass door. Joe walked over to speak with her, his hand resting casually near his concealed weapon. "We're not open until 9 a.m., Joe said through the glass. "I understand," the woman replied, holding up official-looking identification. "We're federal bank examiners, here for a surprise compliance inspection. We need to speak with the manager immediately." Joe's police experience kicked in immediately. Federal bank examiners typically contacted banks in advance to schedule inspections, even when conducting surprise audits. More importantly, genuine federal examiners usually arrived in government vehicles and worked in larger teams. This woman was alone. Her identification was shown too briefly to verify, and her timing was suspiciously close to the bank's most vulnerable operational period. "Let me call the manager," Joe said, stepping back from the door. "Actually," the woman said, her tone changing slightly, "we need to speak with you first. There are some security concerns we need to address." That confirmed Joe's suspicions. Federal examiners would never discuss security concerns with a bank guard before speaking to management. This was definitely the robbery attempt he had been expecting. Joe made a split-second decision that demonstrated why experience matters more than equipment. Instead of immediately triggering the silent alarm, which might prompt the criminals to abort or escalate, Joe decided to gather more intelligence while appearing to cooperate. "Of course," Joe said. "Let me get the manager for you." Joe walked back toward Chen's office, but he didn't go to get the manager. Instead, he activated the silent alarm using a concealed button near the teller stations, immediately notifying Chicago PD that a robbery was in progress. He then used his radio to contact bank security, speaking in code phrases that wouldn't alarm the criminals if they were listening. "This is Joe at First National," he said into his radio. "We have those federal inspectors here for the appointment we discussed. Please confirm that everything is proceeding according to schedule." The security company operator, trained to recognize code phrases, immediately understood that Joe was reporting a robbery in progress and that he couldn't speak freely. "Understood, Joe. Units are responding to your location immediately." By the time Joe returned to the front door, the situation had escalated. The woman was no longer alone. She had been joined by 2 men, one dressed as a delivery driver and another in a business suit. All 3 were now standing at the entrance, and Joe could see that they were becoming impatient. "Mr. Chen will be right with you," Joe said through the glass, stalling for time. "Open the door now," the delivery driver said, his friendly demeanor replaced by obvious threat. "We're coming in whether you cooperate or not." Joe realized that the criminals had decided to abandon subtlety and force their way into the bank. At this point, he had to choose between allowing them entry and hoping police would arrive in time, or taking direct action to prevent them from accessing the building. Joe chose direct action. "Sir," Joe said loudly enough for everyone in the bank to hear, "I'm going to need to see proper federal identification before I can allow you into the building." The three criminals exchanged glances. They had expected to gain entry through deception and intimidation, not to face resistance from an elderly security guard. Thompson, the leader dressed as a businessman, made a quick decision. "Step away from the door, old man," Thompson said, producing what appeared to be a federal badge but was actually a sophisticated forgery. "This is official business, and you're interfering with a federal investigation." Joe studied the badge through the glass door, using his police experience to identify details that proved it was fake. The serial numbers were wrong, the photo quality was inconsistent with genuine federal identification, and the lamination showed bubbles that indicated amateur production. "I'm sorry," Joe said calmly, "but I'm not authorized to admit anyone without proper management approval. Let me call Mr. Chen." That's when Foster, the woman posing as a federal examiner, made a critical mistake. "Look, Grandpa," she said, dropping her professional tone, "we don't have time for this bureaucratic nonsense. Open the door or we'll find another way in." Joe smiled slightly. After 30 years of police work, he had heard thousands of criminals try to bluff their way past security measures. Foster's language and attitude confirmed that these weren't federal examiners. They were the professional criminals he had been watching for months. "Ma'am," Joe replied, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had perfected during decades of police work. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You're not federal examiners, you're not here for a compliance inspection, and you're about to make a very serious mistake." The three criminals froze. The elderly security guard they had dismissed as irrelevant was speaking with the confidence and authority of someone who knew exactly what was happening. "You've been watching this bank for 6 months," Joe continued, loud enough for the bank employees to hear and understand the situation. "You planted listening devices, conducted surveillance, and studied our procedures. But you made one error in your planning. You assumed I was just a harmless old man." Thompson realized their cover was blown, and that the situation required immediate escalation. He produced a pistol from inside his jacket, pointing it at Joe through the glass door. "Open this door right now," Thompson ordered, "or I start shooting through the glass." Joe didn't flinch. He had faced armed criminals hundreds of times during his police career, and he understood that panic was the enemy of good decision-making. "Sir," Joe said calmly, "my name is Joseph Williams, retired Chicago Police Department, badge number 20847. I've investigated over 200 bank robberies in my career, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that your plan has already failed." Joe's revelation sent shockwaves through both the criminals outside and the bank employees inside. Sarah Martinez, who had been watching the confrontation from the teller area, later described the moment as like watching a completely different person emerge from inside Grandpa Joe. "You have approximately 3 minutes before Chicago PD surrounds this building," Joe continued. "You can walk away now and probably escape, or you can force your way in here and guarantee that you'll spend the next 20 years in federal prison." Thompson was facing a decision that professional criminals dread: abandon a months-long operation or escalate to a level of violence that would bring overwhelming law enforcement response. His crew had planned for resistance from bank employees, but they hadn't planned for resistance from a retired police detective who understood exactly how bank robberies succeeded or failed. Ramirez, the technical specialist, tried to salvage the situation using his electronic skills. He produced a device designed to override the door's electronic locking system, hoping to gain entry despite Joe's resistance. But Joe had been expecting this. During his weeks of counter-surveillance, he had studied the bank's security measures and identified their vulnerabilities. He knew that the electronic locks could be compromised, so he had prepared a backup plan. Joe activated a manual security lock that was hidden behind his security desk, effectively deadbolting the front entrance from the inside. Even if Ramirez successfully hacked the electronic system, The mechanical backup would prevent entry. You gentlemen invested a lot of time and money planning this operation, Joe said through the door, but you missed several important details. First, this building has mechanical security backups that your electronic devices can't override. Second, Chicago PD response time to this location is 2.8 minutes on average, and they've already been notified. Third, I've been studying your surveillance team for 4 months, and I know more about your plan than you do. Thompson realized that continuing the operation was futile. His crew had been outmaneuvered by someone they had completely underestimated. But professional criminals don't like to admit defeat, especially when they've invested months of planning. You think you're smart, old man, Thompson shouted. We know this building's layout. We know your procedures, and we know your weaknesses. We're coming in one way or another. Joe's response demonstrated why experience and preparation matter more than youth and equipment. Sir, Joe said, producing his own weapon for the first time, you're welcome to try. But I should mention that I spent 15 years in Chicago PD's robbery division. I know exactly how criminals like you think, and I've been preparing for this confrontation for 4 months. You've studied this bank, but I've studied you. The sight of Joe's pistol held with the steady grip of someone who clearly knew how to use it changed the dynamics completely. The criminals had expected to intimidate an elderly security guard. Instead, they were facing a retired police detective who was comfortable with armed confrontations. Foster made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. You're making a mistake, she called through the door. We have hostages outside. If you don't cooperate, innocent people will get hurt. Mr. Chen will be right with you, Joe said through the glass, stalling for time. Open the door now, the delivery driver said, his friendly demeanor replaced by obvious threat. We're coming in whether you cooperate or not. Joe realized that the criminals had decided to abandon subtlety and force their way into the bank. At this point, he had to choose between allowing them entry and hoping police would arrive in time, or taking direct action to prevent them from accessing the building. Joe chose direct action. Joe's police training had taught him to recognize bluffs, and this was clearly a bluff. Professional bank robbers avoid taking hostages before entering their target, because hostages attract attention and complicate escape routes. Foster was trying to pressure Joe into cooperation using a threat she couldn't actually carry out. Ma'am, Joe replied, if you had hostages, you would have mentioned them 20 minutes ago. You're bluffing, and you're not very good at it. At that moment, the sound of sirens became audible in the distance. Chicago PD was responding faster than usual because the silent alarm had been triggered by a location with a history of officer safety issues. When a bank reports a robbery in progress, every available unit responds immediately. Thompson made the decision that probably saved his crew from 20-year prison sentences. We're leaving, he told his partners. This job is blown. The 3 criminals walked quickly away from the bank, hoping to reach their escape vehicle before police arrived. They had abandoned their plans, lost their equipment investment, and failed to steal a single dollar. But they had also avoided the catastrophic escalation that would have resulted from forcing their way into a building defended by an armed police veteran. Joe remained at the door, weapon ready, until the first Chicago PD units arrived, 90 seconds later. When Detective Maria Rodriguez of Chicago PD's Robbery Division arrived at First National Bank, she expected to find a standard bank robbery crime scene, traumatized employees, evidence of forced entry, and witness statements from victims who had been too frightened to provide detailed descriptions of the perpetrators. Instead, she found an elderly security guard calmly providing a detailed briefing on the attempted robbery, complete with suspect descriptions, vehicle information, and a timeline of events that read like a professional police report. Detective Rodriguez, Joe said as she approached the bank entrance. Good to see you again. Rodriguez stopped in surprise. Joe Williams, what the hell are you doing here? Working security, Joe replied with a slight smile, though apparently it's not as quiet a job as I thought it would be. Rodriguez had worked with Joe during the final years of his police career, and considered him one of the best robbery detectives Chicago PD had ever employed. Joe's ability to understand criminal psychology and predict criminal behavior had solved cases that other investigators couldn't crack. Joe, why didn't you tell anyone you were working here? Rodriguez asked. Nobody asked, Joe replied. Besides, I figured if trouble ever came looking for this bank, My resume wouldn't matter as much as what I could do about it. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the criminal operation that Joe had single-handedly defeated. The listening device Joe had discovered weeks earlier was submitted to the FBI's Technical Analysis Unit and provided evidence of a sophisticated surveillance operation. Phone records showed that Thompson's crew had been planning the robbery for 6 months, had conducted surveillance on 7 different banks in the Chicago area, and had selected First National as their target because it appeared to have the weakest security measures. Foster's banking industry background was verified through employment records that showed she had worked for 4 different financial institutions before being terminated for embezzlement. Her insider knowledge of banking procedures had allowed the crew to develop a plan that would have bypassed most standard security measures. Ramirez's technical equipment, recovered from their abandoned surveillance vehicle, included sophisticated listening devices, camera equipment, and electronic tools capable of defeating standard bank security systems. The FBI's analysis confirmed that this was professional-grade equipment worth over $50,000. Bank manager David Chen was stunned when he learned the full extent of Joe's background and the danger that had been prevented. "Joe," Chen said during the post-incident interview, "why didn't you tell me you were a retired police detective?" "You never asked about my background," Joe replied. "Besides, I figured that if criminals ever targeted this bank, what mattered wouldn't be what I used to do, but what I could do when it counted." The story quickly spread through Chicago's law enforcement community and then to national media. Grandfather's security guard foils professional bank heist became a headline that captured public imagination, but Joe was uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone with my training would have done," Joe told the Chicago Tribune. "These criminals made a classic mistake. They assumed that because I looked harmless, I must be harmless. In police work, we have a saying: appearances can be deceiving, but preparation never lies." Sarah Martinez, the head teller who had called Joe Grandpa Joe for 3 years, struggled to reconcile the gentle man she knew with the professional who had faced down armed criminals. "It's like he was 2 different people," Sarah told investigators. "The Joe we knew was sweet and quiet, and seemed like he wouldn't hurt a fly. But when those criminals showed up, he became someone completely different. Professional, confident, in control. It was like watching Superman come out of Clark Kent." The FBI became involved in the case because bank robbery is a federal crime, and their investigation revealed that Thompson's crew was responsible for successful robberies in Indianapolis, Milwaukee, and Des Moines. Agent Patricia Holbrook, who led the federal investigation, credited Joe's actions with not only preventing the Chicago robbery, but also providing crucial evidence for the multi-state investigation. Mr. Williams' professional observation and documentation of the surveillance activities gave us our first real break in tracking this crew, Agent Holbrook explained to reporters. His ability to recognize criminal behavior patterns and gather intelligence without alerting the suspects was textbook law enforcement work. The 3 criminals were eventually arrested in separate locations over the following 2 weeks. Thompson was captured in Detroit while attempting to recruit new crew members for a different operation. Foster was arrested in St. Louis after trying to use false identification to open bank accounts. Ramirez was found in Kansas City, attempting to sell his surveillance equipment. During their interrogation, all 3 criminals expressed shock at having been outmaneuvered by someone they had completely dismissed as a threat. "We spent months studying that bank," Thompson told FBI investigators. "We knew everything about their procedures, their schedules, their security systems. The one thing we never considered was that the old security guard might actually know what he was doing." Foster's statement to investigators revealed how thoroughly the crew had underestimated Joe. "We watched him for weeks. He looked like everyone's grandfather, reading newspapers and doing crossword puzzles. We thought he was just there to check employee badges and smile at customers. We never imagined he was a retired cop, let alone someone who specialized in bank robberies." The prosecution team used the case as an example of how professional criminals can be defeated by professional preparation. During Thompson's sentencing hearing, the federal prosecutor stated, "The defendants spent 6 months planning what they believed was the perfect crime. They were defeated by a man who spent 30 years learning how to prevent exactly this type of crime. All three criminals received federal sentences ranging from 12 to 18 years in prison. The significant sentences reflected not only the attempted robbery but also their connection to multiple successful robberies in other states. Joe Williams returned to work at First National Bank the following day. But everything had changed. The story of his confrontation with professional bank robbers had made national news, and the quiet security guard was now the most famous employee in the building. It was surreal, Sarah Martinez later recalled. One day he was Grandpa Joe reading the sports section, and the next day he was this famous hero with reporters calling the bank and asking for interviews. But Joe handled the attention with the same quiet professionalism he had shown during the robbery attempt. He declined most interview requests, avoided publicity, and tried to return to his normal routine as quickly as possible. The bank's corporate office offered Joe a promotion to regional security director, which would have involved overseeing security operations for multiple branches and training other security personnel. Joe politely declined. "I like working the front door," Joe told David Chen. "It's the best place to see who's coming and going. And after 30 years of chasing criminals, I've learned that prevention is better than investigation." Joe did accept one change to his working conditions. The bank installed updated security equipment and implemented new protocols based on Joe's recommendations. His experience in robbery investigation had revealed vulnerabilities that standard security assessments had missed. The Chicago Police Department offered Joe a consulting position, helping to train bank security personnel and develop improved robbery prevention strategies. Joe accepted this part-time role, which allowed him to share his expertise while continuing his work at First National. "Joe's knowledge of criminal behavior and robbery methodology is invaluable," explained Commander Robert Hayes of Chicago PD's Robbery Division. "He understands how criminals think, how they plan, and most importantly, how they can be stopped." Joe's favorite recognition, however, came from an unexpected source. 3 months after the attempted robbery, he received a handwritten letter from Margaret Thompson, the mother of crew leader Marcus Thompson. "Mr. Williams," the letter read, "I know my son tried to rob your bank, and I know he's going to prison because of what you did. But I want to thank you for stopping him without anyone getting hurt. Marcus has been making bad choices since he left the army, and maybe prison will give him a chance to think about what he's doing with his life. You could have hurt him, but you didn't. You could have let him succeed and become an even worse criminal, but you did. Thank you for caring enough about right and wrong to do your job properly." Joe kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. The attempted robbery also brought unexpected benefits to First National Bank. The national media coverage of Joe's heroism attracted new customers who wanted to do business with a bank that took security seriously. Deposits increased by 15% in the 6 months following the incident. More importantly, the bank's corporate office implemented Joe's security recommendations across their entire network of branches. His insights into criminal behavior and robbery methodology became part of the company's standard security training program. Joe Williams continued working at First National Bank for 3 more years before finally retiring at age 70. During his remaining time there, the bank never experienced another security incident of any kind. On Joe's final day of work, the bank held a small retirement party in his honor. The entire staff attended, along with several Chicago police officers and FBI agents who had worked on the robbery case. Detective Maria Rodriguez presented Joe with a plaque that read, "To Joseph Williams, proving that the best security system isn't technology, it's having the right person in the right place, who cares enough to pay attention." Sarah Martinez, who had called Joe Grandpa Joe for 6 years, gave the most fitting tribute. "Joe taught us that you can't judge people by appearances. He looked like everyone's grandfather, but he had the heart of a guardian angel and the skills of a professional protector. We always felt safe with Joe watching the door, and now we know why." Joe's response was typically modest. "I just did what I was trained to do." After 30 years of police work, you learn that criminals count on good people to be unprepared, unaware, and unwilling to act. The best way to stop crime is to be more prepared than the criminals, more aware than they expect, and willing to do what's necessary when it matters. Joseph Williams passed away peacefully in 2018 at the age of 84. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune was longer than most, detailing both his distinguished police career and his unlikely second act as a bank security hero. But Joe's real legacy isn't found in newspaper headlines or police commendations. It's found in the principle he embodied, that ordinary people in ordinary jobs can accomplish extraordinary things when they bring dedication, preparation, and professional pride to their work. The three criminals who tried to rob First National Bank learned a lesson that all criminals eventually learn. There's always someone who's been preparing longer, thinking harder, and caring more than they expected. Joe Williams proved that real security doesn't come from cameras, alarms, or technology. Real security comes from having people who understand that protection is a responsibility, not just a job. Thompson's crew spent 6 months planning what they thought was the perfect crime. They were defeated by a man who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly that moment. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening. Sometimes experience matters more than equipment. And sometimes the difference between success and failure is having someone who cares enough to pay attention and is skilled enough to act when action is needed. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who believes that preparation beats luck every time. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age or appearance? Have you ever met someone whose quiet exterior hid extraordinary capabilities? Until next time, remember that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just show up to work every day, do their job professionally, and wait patiently for the moment when their lifetime of preparation makes all the difference. Joe Williams proved that sometimes the best defense against a perfect crime is an imperfect hero who refuses to give up. The old security guard everyone called Grandpa Joe turned out to be exactly what First National Bank needed. A professional who understood that protecting people isn't about looking tough. It's about being ready when ready matters most.